Part 77. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 773. I've always been curious. Subai looked at his father calmly. Why do you always see me in the memory screen? Su Yuhang couldn't hear Subai's voice. At least judging from his current expression, he seemed to have just sensed someone peeping at him, that's all. But Subai has always had a question before, and that is why Su Yuhang can always sense him. No matter when he sees the previous pictures or some pictures with Su Yuhang by chance, Su Yuhang can always sense him. Before, Subai thought that this was because Su Yuhang was too powerful, so powerful that he could see through the past and the future, so powerful that even the barriers of time and space could not hinder his perception, just like it's the same as the tombstone at the place of enlightenment. However, now, this time, Subai seemed to have figured something out. He looked at Su Yuhang in front of him, and then pointed at his head. If we rule out the possibility that you are really so powerful that there are no limits, there is another possibility, that is, you have always existed in my memory, so whenever I get the opportunity to peek into the past memories, you can always, if you find me, you can always find me, because my memory and cognition are originally where you exist. A smile gradually appeared on Subai's lips. Perhaps, even the broadcasters did not expect that things would develop to this situation. As far as the broadcast is concerned, it wants Subai to become what it likes, such as the state of the bloody corpse after losing his wife. For their cheap parents, they regard Subai more as a container for their existence. They exist in Subai's cognition, or they do not completely exist in Subai's memory and cognition. But Subai's memory cognition is their home and an important part of their three cunning rabbit holes, because they should also understand that they cannot put all their eggs in one basket. As for Lichi, she was imitating the path taken by her cheap parents. In fact, Subai had already guessed in her heart that Lichi abducted the little guy because he probably wanted to treat the little guy Su Yuxuan as his second self. Use it to pave the way for her return of Lichi. There is a three-party struggle, one is the supreme broadcaster, one is the cheap parents who have been able to hide themselves from the broadcaster's eyes for a long time, and the other is Lichi, a rising player. They all carry out their own plans around Subai, and it is precisely because of the relationship between these three parties that things are slipping into a special area. Subai remembered that he had talked with Su Fuegui. Subai told him about his powerlessness and confusion, because no matter who he faced, he seemed to be helpless and could not even find them at all. This kind of feeling that he knew he had enemies but could not touch them. The most despairing feeling is to touch the enemy's sleeves. At that time, Su Fuegui just advised Subai that you were helpless in the past because you were weak. It was not your fault. Anyway, because of the broadcast, they couldn't kill you directly, so they gave you a chance to wait. Time, you just need to be prepared. When the opportunity appears in front of you, seize it decisively and give it a try. Only in this way can you hope to separate yourself from the role of a chess piece. Even if you can't directly become a chess player, at least you can step aside and be a bystander. Now, Subai vaguely felt that his opportunity had really come. Broadcasting hopes to completely change Subai, get rid of the past Subai, create the Subai it wants to see, and then raise Subai like a pet in the place of enlightenment to prevent Subai from running around and appearing in any kind of trouble. Unexpectedly, he was saving his strength there for future use. This can also explain why Su Fuegui had to replace him when he was expected to have a good result in the broadcast. It is precisely because the story world of One Day in Prison constantly stimulates Subai and makes Subai's consciousness gradually break away from his original values that allows Subai to gain a way to look at himself from the perspective of a bystander. Opportunity, so, it's an opportunity created by the environment and it's also an opportunity created by broadcasting. Immediately, the theme of the day was that Lichi asked Hai Mei to kidnap the little guy. The addition of Lichi catalyzed the whole process, just like the originally peaceful chemical reaction state suddenly changed due to the addition of the catalyst. It got violent. When Subai really began to lose all hope and was completely fed up with everything, the stimulation of the leaves to the soul inspired the residual characteristics of his soul after absorbing the eel. This eel was originally used as an object to punish the female corpse, and it had its own magic. But now, its function is Sudbai's entry point for this opportunity. Finally, Jin Zi's integration of Sudbai in Guangzhou changed some characteristics of Sudbai's soul. Even if Sudbai cannot have the ability to change the virtual direction of time similar to Jin Zi, it can at least make Sudbai's soul easier to accept the mode of virtual transformation of memory. Of course, the most important point is that Broadcast wants Sudbai to get rid of everything in his past and become a new Sudbai, but Sudbai's parents survive in Sudbai's memory. Once Sudbai deviates from his past, this means that the cheap parents in his memory will also be punished together. Therefore, when Sudbai has long since given up on himself, the world of this one-day prisoner's story has not yet ended. This is what Sudbai's cheap parents are wrestling with on the radio. Result: Su Fuegui said that Sudbai should be prepared and wait for the opportunity, because Su Fuegui himself knew that with Su Yuhang's personality, it would be difficult for him to leave any chance to someone he hated. It was later confirmed that he was dead when he came out, so Su Yuhang didn't come to see him, because it was very likely that Su Yuhang already knew that he was dead. He couldn't make any waves with a dead man. Otherwise, with Su Yuhang's caution, how could he allow an ancient being of his own generation to suddenly be freed? He was in the middle of a game with the broadcaster. How could he allow the other party to suddenly come out and stab him in the back? Su Yuhang was still looking in the direction of Sudbai. He still didn't seem to hear Sudbai's words, and could only vaguely sense that there was someone here. And Sudbai didn't really care whether Su Yuhang really couldn't hear or pretended not to see, because it made no difference to Sudbai. In fact, Sudbai himself did not expect that this situation would arise in the end, but when it came, Sudbai immediately understood what he should do. Sudbai slowly approached the baby who was being washed by the cold water from the faucet, and then he closed his eyes. At this moment, Sudbai began to gradually build a connection with the baby in his heart. This baby is Sudbai himself. At the same time, this baby is also Sudbai's lost or covered up memory. He is rediscovering this memory and regaining what he has lost. Sudbai's life was full of shortcomings, but he relied on his shortcomings to get to where he is today, and now, he wants to make up for himself. What surprised Sudbai slightly was that there was no hatred in the baby's heart, because at his age, he didn't know what hatred meant. His heart was full of doubts and grievances. People often talk about innocence. Generally speaking, innocence in the true sense only occurs during childhood. When a child grows up and starts to take the initiative to take red envelopes without wanting to give them to his parents, or even when a child starts to dislike certain foods. When the food is not in line with his own taste, his innocent heart disappears, because he is no longer the pure person who eats, sleeps, eats, and doesn't care about anything and doesn't ask anything. He begins to be greedy and angry. Their behaviors are guided by emotions such as obsession, hatred, love, evil, desire, and so on. He is born and has just left his mother's body. He has no thinking or logic of his own, but he has his own emotions. Some studies say that not long after the sperm and egg combine to form a fertilized egg, he is already capable of sensing pain. Therefore, in the so-called abortion, irresponsible parents naively think that the child is not born and knows nothing. Even if it is aborted, there will be no pain. This is a complete lie to deceive themselves and others. This baby had a pure yearning for the world outside the mother's body and was full of curiosity about the unknown world. However, he never expected that what greeted him was not a warm embrace or swaddling clothes, but ice-cold water, mercilessly impacting his immature body. Sudbai's body began to tremble. He had completely integrated into the baby's emotions. He was retrieving his own memory, which was even more complete than that of ordinary people. After all, who could remember how many children he had just given birth to? Month or even the first day after birth. The pair of cheap parents beside him seemed to have become the background at this time. They remained motionless because this was Sudbai's memory. When Sudbai, the master, appeared here forcefully, everything here was dominated by him. In the process, Sudbai sensed the baby's psychological fluctuations and captured all the information. At the same time, the picture here began to compress, leaving a large blank space. Just like when playing a video on a web page, it was shrunk and moved to a corner position. The blank picture gradually became clearer. First, there was a fixed static picture, like a photo. This was a family portrait, with a man and a woman, a housekeeper and a maid. There was a bronze box between the man and woman. In the lower right corner of the photo, a young child is kneeling there with a talisman on his forehead. His eyes are dull and his skin is slightly green. Sudbai's figure appeared next to the young child, and at the same time, the picture began to move. The photographer directed everyone to pose. Whether it was the photographer, the maid, or the housekeeper, they didn't seem to see the young child kneeling on the ground, still doing their own thing. Su Yuhang, who was originally staring at the camera and preparing to take pictures, turned his attention to the toddler, or in other words, Sudbai. Sudbai was used to this kind of gaze and could ignore it. He slowly knelt down beside the child. Deep in his heart, he began to build a bridge of communication with the child. Sudbai knew clearly. Own counterattack. It's just begun. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 774. The picture gradually transforms from the stillness of the photo to the dynamic state. Naturally, the fluctuations in people's hearts also begin to change. Su Yuhang's eyes were not staring at the camera at this time, but at Sudbai's back. The feeling of thorns in the back still existed, but Sudbai had deliberately stabilized his heart. I still remember that in the past, every time by chance, Sudbai would take a peek at his previous memory scene. Every time he was stared at by Su Yuhang, Sudbai would start to panic, and then he would have to force out the memory scene. Of course, there was shock that Su Yuhang could see him, but the bigger reason should be that Su Yuhang completely occupied his past memory and regarded it as his home, so he was the one who drove Sudbai out. After all, with Sudbai's temperament and experience after becoming an audience, it is understandable that being scared by Su Yuhang once caused him to become uneasy and withdraw from the memory screen, but to be scared out several times in a row is a bit unbelievable. Sudbai is not that fragile. This time, if we compare the forces to each other, they are a bit like Yuan Shikai, who stole the fruits of the revolution after the revolution of 1911. If the broadcast had not wanted to get rid of the former Sudbai, Su Yuhang would not have resisted. When the two sides confronted each other, Su Yuhang succeeded in taking what he wanted, otherwise, it would be difficult for him to have such an opportunity. Envy, confusion, confusion. This is the inner activity of the young child at this time. He really hopes to stand with his parents and take a family photo, but he doesn't know why he has to kneel here motionless. This makes him very confused. He doesn't know that he has done something wrong. I didn't know what I should do, because my parents didn't seem to tell me what I should do to make them happy, and they never consulted me. Even when I used to wander around the house, they also often ignore themselves. Still no hate, still no hate. Sudbai slowly savored the feeling at this moment. The baby in the first scene had no hatred in his heart, and the young self kneeling here still had no hatred in his heart. He even looked forward to being with the man and woman. Standing together to take a family photo, my heart is filled with this desire. At first, Sudbai couldn't understand it, but slowly, when Sudbai completely replaced himself at that time, he slowly felt relieved. For a child of this age, how much love and hate can you ask him to understand? The meaning of hatred and freedom is indeed a bit unrealistic. He only cares about what he can see in front of him. For example, why can't I stand with everyone when we take a family photo? Sudbai took a deep breath. Perhaps, without this experience, it would be difficult for him to truly understand himself. He thought that whether it was himself as a baby or as a child, his heart should be filled with endless thoughts. Hatred and resentment, he was even ready to accept such emotions, but there was none at all, really none. This picture began to shrink, and then, another picture appeared in the surrounding open area. In the picture, a young man was floating slowly in a glass container filled with culture fluid in a room. The glass was very clear, and therefore, the young man deliberately saw things in the room clearly. Sudbai's figure appeared outside the glass. He saw a black cat crawling on the table opposite, turning over the scroll after a while. This is auspicious. It's just that Ji Xiang obviously can't see himself like Su Yuhang. It's still doing its own thing. A picture scroll is a story and an experience, and the theme of the picture scroll is mostly about the happy moments of children and parents together. Some practice calligraphy with their father, some practice piano with their mother, and some travel to the Nurgai grassland with their parents. As the sun sets, the grassland is dyed with orange light. The young man leans on his mother's back and watches the sunset, looking at the grassland, watching the herds of cattle and sheep. When Sudbai saw this scene, his heart began to twitch uncontrollably. In fact, the experiences of being held by Su Yuhang and rinsed under the faucet when he was a baby, and the experiences of kneeling in the corner with affixed talismans on them, were completely incomparable. This picture. Sudbai could accept the forced torture and humiliation, but this kind of beautiful deception was the most tormenting and hurtful. Sudbai still remembered that he had just learned that his childhood was completely painted within a painting. At that moment, it seemed as if all the strength had been drained from the whole person, and I was so distressed that I couldn't breathe. Jixiang was still continuing his work. He seemed a little bored. He looked at the scenery in the scroll and at Sudbai in the glass petri dish. It still has the same high B-level appearance as if it is light and breezy, as if all this has nothing to do with it. If the calculation is correct, it has only been a few years since Jixiang was brought out from the place of enlightenment by Su Yuhang. So, the reason why Jixiang in later generations fell in love with the little guy and took good care of it is because Jixiang was infected by the secular world. At this time, it is actually similar to Ruyi in the place of enlightenment now. Ruyi will not take care of the child or even come over with fresh milk for the child. Sudbai hesitated for a long time. He looked at himself in the petri dish next to him. He did not dare to close his eyes to establish an inner connection, because Sudbai could guess what kind of person he was in the petri dish. Mood. Taking a deep breath and exhaling it heavily, Sudbai paused. The slight trembling of his palms indicated that Sudbai was not at peace at this time. At this moment, the young man in the petri dish suddenly started to flutter, and the culture solution shook. Sudbai was startled. Looking over, he saw his young self naturally posing with his hands in front of him in the petri dish. The posture with legs slightly spread apart is a bit like the horseback riding dance that was once popular all over the world. He turned back and looked at the scroll. In this scroll, Su Yuhang and himself were riding horses. He was nestled in front of Su Yuhang, holding the reins with both hands and looking ahead with excitement. The wind is very light, the clouds are light, and the sunshine is pleasant. Riding a horse and walking at this time is definitely a very enjoyable thing. The horse bumps from time to time, which makes you a little scared, but then you feel the stalwart and warm embrace of your father behind you, and you suddenly feel extremely peaceful inside. This is out of trust in your father. At this age, almost every normal family in the eyes of a boy, his father is the first idol in his life. He can take himself to buy toys, tell himself stories, give himself pocket money, and sit astride his neck and shoulders. However, Subai knew in his heart that he could not afford to hesitate too much, because if he missed this opportunity, it would be difficult for him to escape the fate of becoming a pawn. Sighing, Subai stretched out his hand and put it against the glass vessel. Slowly, Subai's heart began to connect with himself in the glass petri dish. Joy. Happy. Satisfy. Pride. Good. Wonderful. All kinds of gratifying emotions began to be transmitted to Subai through himself in the petri dish. But these beautiful emotions failed to bring any happiness to Subai. On the contrary, Subai's heart felt as uncomfortable as being twisted. Every joy, every satisfaction, every pride, every admiration was like a sharp needle piercing Subai's heart. Subai still persisted and continued to accept these beautiful emotions. Even if they were poison, Subai had to face them. Because this is the lost self, the memories of my past, and now, I must find them back, otherwise I will be either complete or defective. In a daze, Subai raised his head, and suddenly found himself in the glass petri dish with his entire face pressed against the glass container, looking at him calmly. Subai panicked for a moment, because this kind of gaze made him feel suddenly scared. Yes, when he faced his past self, he actually felt an emotion called fear. How is this going? The other party changed from the dreamy riding state before, with his face pressed against the glass, looking at him motionlessly, with a hint of gloom in his eyes, as if a resentful spirit was watching you from the top of your bed. Subai actually didn't dare to face the other party's eyes. Ah 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 ah. 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 The young self in the petri dish began to howl like crazy, his hands and legs kept beating the petri dish, and hysterical screams came out of his mouth, as if everything in front of him was the object of his venting. All are outlets for one's own violence. He is angry. He growled. He is crazy. He was flopping around like a madman, like a mentally ill person. He was struggling, he wanted to leave the petri dish, he was flopping upwards, he was like a drowning man desperately trying to get his face out of the water. Take a breath of fresh air, even if it's just a breath, you can't wait. This scene made Subai very familiar. It's clearly the same person he was when he was sick. The self that was left here as a child to fill in memories turned out not to be ignorant. Every time it discovered that all this was false, it would get angry and roar. The more beautiful the picture in the scroll, the louder his roar and struggle. It's intense. At this time, the door was pushed open, and a man's figure walked in. His eyes first fell on the young man in the petri dish, and then he looked at Subai on one side, but his movements did not stop. He reached out to grab the young man in the petri dish, and flicked Subai's forehead with his fingertips. The young man in the petri dish shuddered, as if he had been hit hard, and his violent eyes dissipated instantly, leaving only confusion. Then, the confused young man's attention gradually began to fall on the beautiful picture in front of him. There was a beautiful and happy look on his face again. Like crazy. Drunk. Take a break, the 5th update should be finished after midnight. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 775. To ordinary people, finding the self that was once lost probably means finding the simplest and purest version of oneself. It is a re-examination of the self. But for Subai, finding the past is the most important thing. It is something without any lyricism or pretense. Because his life has flaws, and what he is doing now is to complete his life. In the 3 scenes, there are 3 Subais, standing by the pool of the hospital, in the corner of the yard, and next to the container of the glass petri dish. These 3 scenes are the 3 points of Subai's life. The first one represents birth, the birth of his life. No matter whether the physical body has been replaced, at least this day and this moment means Sudbai's person, this thought, this consciousness, this independent personality recognized by the broadcast. Born. Because if the broadcast does not recognize that Sudbai is a deliberately independent person, he will not be included in the terror broadcast. The second one represents Sudbai's fate. On this day, he began to become a test subject, entered another body, and began to exist as Sudbai. This was the turning point of his fate. The third one represents childhood. Most of the best parts of life are childhood. Most people will miss their childhood, but Sudbai's childhood was the beginning of torture and the starting point of inner distortion. When Sudbai saw his hysterical and crazy eyes in the glass container, he understood where the madness and violence imprinted deep in his soul came from. A young man was thrown into a petri dish day and night, and was instilled with beautiful memories. Every time he woke up, he was first filled with his own anger and madness, then suffered suppression, and then continued to be filled with memories. Even a rabbit can bite people and eat human flesh if it continues to be tortured like this, let alone a person with an independent personality. Even if the memory is completely overwritten in the end, the memory and inertia left deep in the soul cannot be changed. At this time, Sudbai was somewhat grateful that he was mentally ill, because this might be the only real thing that his childhood self could leave to him, and it was also the only mark of his childhood. The three pictures shrank together at this time, then widened together, and were juxtaposed together. The three Sudbais in the picture all had their eyes closed. He was still comprehending, and the babies, young children, and teenagers in the picture also slowly closed their eyes. The baby stopped crying, even though the cold water continued to wash his tender body. The young child is no longer aggrieved, even though he still cannot be included in the family photo and take a group photo together. The young man stopped fussing. No matter how beautiful the picture was displayed in front of him, he was not interested in taking another look. In the three pictures, there are three Suyuhangs, and all three Suyuhangs are staring at Sudbai, but there is nothing they can do. Competition. Victory or defeat. Peace. Checkerboard. Start right here. Although it was an accident this time, Sudbai used the power of radio to accidentally start to break his parents' plan for him. In fact, it was equivalent to using radio to exploit the loopholes of radio. Strictly speaking, what he is doing now has nothing to do with himself. Cheap parents avoided the attention of the broadcasters and began to plan and experiment on themselves. There is no essential difference. In the living room, Jaime was lying on the floor, drool dripping from the corner of his mouth, his eyes were distracted, and his body was trembling slightly. He had already exhausted himself by taking off the mask and was forcibly soul-searched by the monk again. Now it really happened. Confused and delirious. The monk's face turned pale, and his soul suffered a huge backlash. Searching for souls was not an easy task. Moreover, he also encountered a steel plate. Jaime was a spiritual enhancer and had received it several times. When Lychee came to possess him, his soul structure was very high. Even if he took advantage of the opportunity to search for his soul when his vitality was seriously injured, the monk was unsuccessful and could not read the memory. Of course, if it were normal times, the monk would never do this, because if you play like this, the radio will not help you recover from the injury to your soul, because it is your own subjective act of seeking death, and the radio will not help you. I will help you finish the cooking, but now that you are a clone, even if you sell this body and your life to do Sudbai a favor, the monk is willing to do it. This is the difference between eminent monks and ordinary people. They are really very open-minded, even if they are clones. Gyatso sat on the chair next to him, staring at Sudbai lying in the yard. At this time, he suddenly pointed at Sudbai and said, "Have you noticed that Sudbai's breath seems to be a little different? His soul consciousness is constantly expanding as a high-level listener with enhanced illusions. He naturally has more say in the interpretation of things at the spiritual level of the soul. In fact, from the time Sudbai was lying on the ground motionless, he was keenly aware of it. Sensing the changes in Sudbai's soul, like a piano piece, it first experienced a depressed trough, and then began to gain momentum, and the purpose of building momentum was for the final explosion and climax. Ji Zhen stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. He was originally unwilling to share this information with the monk and Gyatso, because he felt that the two monks were not at a high level, but thinking about it, even if he is a high-level audience, everyone should not be 50 steps away. They are all just clones, so there is nothing to hide. The first time I saw him when I walked in here, I noticed that his soul was particularly sensitive, as if he was suppressing something. Moreover, his soul power obviously should not be possessed by senior people. He clearly has advanced abilities. The breadth of the audience, so this is why I choose to believe those things you told me in Kilua. Because I know that Sudbai has been taking the route of strengthening the physical body, I don't believe that when he finally advanced to the advanced audience, he would lead a breakthrough in the physical body with a breakthrough in the soul level. This is simply impossible. The monk kept looking at Sudbai outside. He pursed his lips and said, "It's going to rain. Please hold an umbrella for Dabai." Gyatso nodded, stood up, picked up an umbrella in the living room, and walked to the yard outside the living room. Monk He Zhen also stood up and walked over. Hai Mai Mei actually searches for the soul or not, it doesn't mean much, the monk sighed and continued, when he puts on the mask, it is Lichi who dominates his behavior and thinking, so after Lichi kidnapped the little guy, what will happen? Hai Mai Mei is completely unaware of it. Even though he is actually executing the whole thing, he is just an outsider. This is natural. Even high-level listeners are rarely qualified to participate in the affairs of the big guys, not to mention that he is only a senior person. Xie Zhen agreed. You just said that Dabai's soul is gathering momentum. Is it possible that he is about to break through? The monk asked. Advanced listeners are divided into 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. For someone like me who has just been promoted and has not fully figured out the strength of a senior listener, he is not even considered a junior. In fact, he should also be with I'm about the same, but if he can break through the soul level again this time, he will most likely be directly promoted to the peak of the advanced listener's elementary level, because he is in the physical enhancement stream, and his physical body is already at the elementary level. The only shortcoming is it's the soul. Once the soul is also driven, the improvement in strength is inevitable. The monk sighed after hearing this. Senior listener, when will I be able to break through? Gyatso was also a little embarrassed. Of course, he didn't know that he had actually advanced to a senior audience at that point in time. Because Sudbai himself didn't know about Gyatso's advancement to a senior audience, so naturally he couldn't tell Gyatso. Measures. He has suffered so much, and it's his turn to smile. The monk raised his head and looked at the dark sky. Only when you survive the suffering can you see your youth. Amitabha, my Buddha is compassionate. What does the monk put his hands together? At the same time, Gyatso also put his hands together. Sudbai's body lying in the yard was still damaged, but because the leaf effect faded away, the damage no longer worsened, and the body began to gradually recover itself. Sudbai closed his eyes and felt very calm. This calmness seemed to be the first time since he entered this one-day prisoner's story world. In fact, since entering this story world, he has never been the protagonist, even if the punishment falls on him. Broadcasting wants to transform him, which can be regarded as a transformation of Sudbai himself. Change and revolution have similar meanings. When used on Sudbai, when a past Sudbai is eliminated and a new Sudbai appears, it is actually equivalent to the original Sudbai. Sudbai died. But this revolution not only revolutionized Sudbai's life, but also revolutionized the lives of that man and woman, because they relied on Sudbai's memory to exist. Therefore, when Sudbai had already chosen to give up on himself, the revolution of broadcasting had not yet succeeded, because Soo-Hang had been supporting him in Soodbai's memory. When the two sides fought against each other, Soodbai's originally dispensable role suddenly discovered that I actually had something to do and started picking peaches on my own. Boom. A loud noise came from Soodbai's consciousness. Boom. There was a thunder in the sky at the same time, and heavy rain poured down. The monk, Gyatso, and Xiezhen all seemed to sense something unusual in the thunder. At this time, Soodbai in the three pictures opened his mouth and whispered softly. My past, my memory, my brothers left in the long river of memory. I'll take you. Go home. Compared to Soodbai when he was a baby, Soodbai when he was a child, and Soodbai when he was a teenager, they are indeed Soodbai's younger brothers and wanderers lost outside. And now, Soodbai wants to they awaken and everyone's consciousness becomes one again. Even if the past memory is full of bitterness and pain, at least it can become complete. And, since then, Soodbai. No longer someone else's pawn. Buzz. The baby opened its eyes. The toddler opened his eyes. The young man also opened his eyes. The three Soodbai also opened their eyes together. At the same time, the six people roared angrily. From my memory. Get out. The fifth update is completed, everyone has been waiting for a long time. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 776. From my memory. Get out. This is the will from Soodbai, and it is also Soodbai's cry to declare his sovereignty. It is something that should belong to you, even the most basic thing that most people are born with, but for Soodbai, trying to get it back is so difficult, and it seems that the only chance is now. In the first picture, the baby turned his head and stared at Soo-Hang who was holding him under the faucet to rinse. As the baby turned his head, the water flow stopped at this time, and the temperature in the entire bathroom instantly dropped to the temperature is below zero, and the walls are even covered in white frost. But Soo-Hang's figure was motionless, he couldn't move, the only thing he could control was his gaze. In Soodbai's memory, Soo-Hang could only maintain his own influence and maintain his dominance under the premise of extreme restraint. He could not drastically transform Soodbai's memory to ensure that he would be permanent. He was stationed here. In fact, he was fully capable of directly seizing Soodbai's body. But he can't do this. As Su Fugui said, because of the existence of broadcasting, they dare not kill you. It is precisely because of the existence of broadcasting that Soo-Hang does not dare to be so presumptuous with Soodbai. Tampering with a person's memory seems very simple, but it can easily lead to big problems. Especially in this kind of involuntary change, it is likely to attract the attention of the broadcaster. The focus of the broadcaster is not to discover Soo-Hang's small actions, but the thing to note is actually whether Soodbai can still be called Soodbai under such passive conditions and unknowing memory changes. Broadcasting has its own set of standards for how a listener should be perceived. For example, Soodbai was actually a ghost who took away his body, but after all, he had an independent personality and thinking. At the same time, he also spent his youth and went to middle school, high school to college, allowing him to have his own consciousness and thoughts. Therefore, even if Soodbai's origin is very twisted and not even a normal person's growth path, the broadcast still determines that Soodbai is a person and can become a person. The listener enters the world of the story. And if Soo-Hang excessively tampered with Soodbai's memory, or even controlled Soodbai's memory to an extent that he could never expel, then the change in memory would inevitably lead to a chain reaction, which would affect Soodbai's personality and self-shaping. At that time, it is difficult to say whether Soodbai can continue to be a listener and whether he can be recognized by the radio. For the listeners that the radio cannot recognize, it is often the real-life task of killing them, or more simply, pulling them into the story world. Annihilation. This is why Soo-Hang is in such an embarrassing situation now when faced with Soodbai's strong return to regain control of his memory. The baby grinned and began to scream. At this moment, two fangs appeared in the baby's mouth. These were fangs belonging to zombies, and a zombie aura was bursting out from the baby's body. Immediately afterwards, the baby's fangs directly penetrated Su Yuhang's hand, and corpse gas and corpse poison began to be infused into Su Yuhang's body. At the same time, with a flick of his head, Su Yuhang's arm broke directly. Su Yuhang, who had broken his arm, began to lose control. Under the control of the baby continued to float on the pool, while Su Yuhang's figure began to slowly retreat, gradually submerging into the darkness. This was his retreat, because in the concrete memory picture, it's hard to control and change anything, at most it's just a glance or a look back. This is Sudbai's own memory world, so he can use any means to remove the memories he doesn't want. The child's body began to stand up. His body no longer showed the dark blue color of a zombie, but revealed a blood red color. His body exuded a bloodthirsty and demonic aura. In his mouth, there were also two fangs exposed. Come out, but this is not a zombie, but a vampire. The young child walked towards where the family portrait was, and no one else seemed to see him. Only Su Yuhang's eyes followed his movement. These two people, one big and one small, felt like everyone was drunk and I was alone. However, Su Yuhang has no other ability to move except his gaze, because he wants to sit here and take pictures. According to memory, he is sitting here at this time. He can look away, but cannot take any action without permission. The toddler came to Su Yuhang, opened his mouth, and made a questioning grunt in his throat, as if asking Su Yuhang why he didn't take a family photo with him. Immediately afterwards, the child's fangs pierced Su Yuhang's neck directly, and at the same time began to suck Su Yuhang's blood crazily. Su Yuhang's body began to shrink slowly, and finally, the shadow behind him spread and enveloped him. In the third picture, the boy is still the same boy. His eyes no longer fall on the scroll, but he slaps the glass container in front of him crazily, hysterically, and crazily. Su Yuhang stood in front of the young man and looked at him coldly through the glass container, as if he was looking at a little goldfish trying to struggle in a fish tank. At that time, in that era, Su Yuhang had nothing to do with the young man in front of him. It is no exaggeration to say that the gap between giants and ants is really the same. Su Yuhang's hand reached out and grabbed the boy's head, as he was habitually preparing to knock the boy unconscious. However, the boy smiled slightly at this moment, and blood lines appeared on the boy's skin. Then, the boy raised his fist and smashed it directly at the glass container in front of him. Boom! The glass container shattered instantly, the nutrient solution splashed everywhere, and all the glass shards were pierced into Su Yuhang's body by this tyrannical force, and Su Yuhang's body disappeared again. The bodies of babies, toddlers, and teenagers began to twist, and Sudbai in each picture also began to twist. The three pictures were annihilated together at this time and shattered instantly. There was a Sudbai in each picture. The three Sudbai's figures twisted and spread, and finally merged together. In addition, the baby, toddler, and teenager also slowly integrated into Sudbai's body. This is my home court, this is my private territory. You Su Yuhang. Why do you keep staying here? Until now, Sudbai only saw Su Yuhang's changes and his eyes, but did not see anything unusual about his cheap mother. Therefore, Sudbai roughly guessed that maybe Su Yuhang's share of his memory was they are relatively older, or their cheap mother has not really entered their memory, or they actually have many choices, and they are just one of them. A faint man's figure appeared in Sudbai's consciousness, with a kind of majesty and unruliness. This feeling was like a father who was preparing to teach his disobedient son a lesson. However, this gesture disgusted Sudbai the most. Boom! The space of consciousness is exploding, and the long river of memory belonging to Sudbai is distorting. The man's figure remained motionless, as if he was very sure that Sudbai could not take action against him. Because of his image, his identity, and his stay, he himself was actually a part of Sudbai's memory. Forcibly expelling him was tantamount to scraping the bones and treating poison on the soul. Your progress surprises me. A man's voice came from the black shadow. This voice was very familiar to Sudbai. It was Su Yuhang. Back then, Su Yuhang had trapped Su Fugui in the place of enlightenment for 20 years, and at the same time brought Jixiang out. At the same time, he had been plotting with the broadcast for so many years. If he were to look at it from the perspective of another bystander and listener, Su Yuhang could definitely do it. Serve as an idol or role model. But from Sudbai's perspective, the person in front of him is the target that he must kill. People often say that the greatest hatred is nothing more than killing a relative, but here, it seems to be a bit more advanced, because Sudbai's parents are his biggest enemies. What they killed was his childhood, and at the same time, they almost killed him. Kill your own destiny. You know, your mother and I had an argument about you. Su Yuhang's voice was still calm. Even now in his memory, Sudbai had the initiative and advantage. At that time, I felt that the child seems to be eager to integrate into our family. In fact, I also know some things. In Qinhuangdao, you would go crazy for her and even kill someone to avenge her without even being punished. Sometimes I really think, if I really treat you as my son, at least, you will be a very filial child, right? This question carries a touch of sadness and a touch of sadness. But it is the choice of life and the choice of path. It is actually meaningless to talk about these now. The choice was made more than 20 years ago and the road has been passed long ago. Faced with Sudbai's persecution, Su Yuhang still seemed unhurried and said, "The real me is no longer in your memory, and if you get rid of me, you will pay the price of heavy damage to your soul, and you will even fall from the level of a high-level audience come down. At this price, the radio will not help you recover. You have expelled me from your memory, and I can no longer have any influence on you, right?" Sudbai continued to press Su Yuhang step by step. "Su Yuhang," Sudbai shouted. "Yes," Su Yuhang responded. "Father." "LOL, yes." "Dad." There is something I have always wanted to say to you." "Say, I'll listen." "First of all, I don't believe that even if you have left here, the dissipation of your soul will not have any impact on you. Secondly, I really want to say something to you. That is, come. Hurt each other. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 777. Sudbai is very decisive and leaves no room for negotiation. When one party chooses to fight to the death, the other party automatically loses other options. Su Yuhang sighed and said, "The broadcast is just a drunkard's intention. You killed a senior person, but do you need to arrange such an innovative story world to punish you? This is an independent story world set up to punish Sudbai for killing a senior and trapping another senior. It is indeed a bit deliberate, and it is easy to think that the real target of the broadcast may not be Sudbai. If it is just simply punishing an unruly senior, audience can be done in a simpler and more direct way. There is no need to make it so complicated. From the perspective of consequentialism, if the broadcast wants to innovate Sudbai, Sudbai will just change his self, and for Su Yuhang, who exists in Sudbai's memory, it is equivalent to erasure. Therefore, this can be regarded as the broadcast sanctions against Su Yuhang. Broadcasting has broadcasting rules, and it has always been operating according to its rules. It is omniscient and omnipotent, at least Sudbai thought so, and Su Fugui thought so too at the beginning. So it is very possible that broadcasting actually knows the position of his cheap parents, but because of the position they are in, broadcasting cannot follow their normal procedures to attack them. It is like solving a high numerical problem. You know answer, but you can't write down the steps to solve the problem, so you still won't get points. Just like when Sudbai almost killed Su Yuhang's father, his grandfather, Broadcasting almost issued a killing order directly against Subai, even though Broadcasting himself knew in his heart that the couple was a breaker of rules for him, similar to its a moth, but it can't be helped. It must act according to the rules. Broadcasting is probably in that state, but this does not affect Broadcasting to start executing its own clearing plan under the conditions permitted by the rules. The essence of the story world this time is probably like this. Innovating Subai and subverting Subai's character is almost equivalent to replacing Subai with a different person. It is a kind of punishment, because for Subai's self-esteem for a person with a strong sense of consciousness, erasing all his personality and recognition of his former son's friends is something he cannot accept. He feels that this is actually equivalent to him being dead now. But for the rest of the audience, it's likely that as long as they stay alive, that's fine. Therefore, in the eyes of the vast majority of the audience, this punishment is really just a slight punishment. After all, you are not dead. Even if your temperament changes drastically, you are still not dead. You are still alive, and your name is Su White, isn't it? Actually, you have the opportunity to witness a higher scenery with us. Su Yuhang's voice came again. Do you really not want to see the true face of Broadcasting? Look at UXX. Subai's response was very simple and straightforward. At the same time, the majestic sea of consciousness completely pressed against Su Yuhang. Subai used his own sea of consciousness, his own mental power, and his own soul to attack. This was a way of killing 1,000 enemies and losing 800, but Subai really didn't care about this. Su Yuhang shook his head. At this time, he felt what Fatty Monk and the others felt before, and what was even more ironic was that the twisted character of this experimental subject was actually caused by himself. However, at this time, Su Yuhang had no time to reflect on his previous education problems. He was not willing to be erased, at least, not to be erased by the experimental product he left behind. Even if it's just a ray of separated soul. Boom. 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 3 powerful collisions occurred. Boom. 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 3 thunders sounded in the sky in succession. At the same time, with Subai lying in the yard as the center, the surrounding area slowly sunk in, and Subai's eyes, ears, mouth, and nose were already leaking blood at this time. His soul consciousness is very confused, the monk said. This point did not need to be explained to the senior audience, the monk himself could see it. Is this what is called, the battle between heaven and man in your heart? Gyatso asked with some confusion. At this time, Xie Zhen had not yet learned from Liang Sen the speculation that Subai's parents might live in his son's cognition through the experiment on Subai in the cemetery. Therefore, he had no idea what was happening in Subai's body. Everything that happened was also a bit confusing. This is clearly a duel between 2 consciousnesses in the sea of consciousness. Judging from the current level of the duel, even if Subai wins in the end, there is a high probability that his soul will collapse and even become an idiot. So, who is the other consciousness that is confronting Subai? It can't be a Broadcast, right? This idea was immediately rejected by Xie Zhen himself as soon as it appeared. No matter how exaggerated it was impossible to compete with the radio. The rain was getting heavier and heavier. Even though Gyatso kept holding an umbrella for Subai, the running water in the yard would still accumulate. In addition, a small pit sunk under Subai's body, making it easier to store water. Faced with this situation, both Xie Zhen, the monk, and Gyatso were at a loss what to do. What the 3 of them could do now seemed to be to stand on the sidelines and watch Subai continue to raise the corpse. However, at this moment, Subai suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes were cloudy and his pupils could not be seen. But Subai's voice still came out. Outside the house, Senior, capture alive. Subai said these words intermittently, and the next moment, his eyes closed again. There was a battle between heaven and man going on between him and Su Yuhang. This was also because this was his home court and occupied a certain area. That's why I dared to talk out of distraction at this time. But Su Yuhang over there seemed to understand something, and went crazy from passively resisting Sudbai's impact to actively attacking, otherwise Sudbai really wanted to speak more clearly. In the son's body, the father and son were fighting. This situation seemed a bit funny, but it really happened. When they heard the message from Sudbai, who suddenly opened his eyes, the three people on the side were stunned for a moment. Fortunately, Sudbai's message was relatively complete, although it was relatively brief. Outside the house, the senior ones are captured alive. 3 simple words, but deliberately connected together. There is a senior person outside the house, and he needs to be captured alive. The last word, capture alive, is not because Sudbai is being pretentious, because whether it is a monk, gyatso, or Jizhen, they all agree that they are clones. If it were in the real world, they would naturally not dare to kill the audience indiscriminately. But they don't care now. If Sudbai is not captured alive, he will probably be killed directly by these people. After all, he is a clone, so it would be nice to do something extraordinary. I understood the meaning, but someone has to do it. Since we are going to catch the senior people outside, sending senior listeners is naturally the best choice. The monk and gyatso can stay here to take care of them. After saying a few words, they continued. Sudbai stands up. Amitba, there is no loss for you anyway, but Sudbai will remember this favor, the monk said. Haha, I understand this. Jizhen signaled to the monk that there was no need to say anything more, and he walked out of the house directly. For an illusion enhancer, mental power is almost the foundation. In fact, when he came, he had already caught a senior listener hiding nearby, but he didn't care at the time. Now that Sudbai suddenly called him, go and catch that guy, then catch him. The speed is indeed very fast, and the important reason is actually that senior listeners catch senior people, which is really no different from an eagle catching a chicken. Only 5 minutes later, Xie came back. He held old Shen in his hand and threw him directly next to Sudbai. Soul seizure, the monk knelt down and looked at old Shen, whose 5 senses were directly blocked by the instructions, and naturally discovered the difference in this Qinbing's body. Wait a minute, I will arrest his soul. What Sudbai wants is probably this body. Jizhen pressed down with one hand and slapped it on old Shen's forehead, and then a bright yellow flame appeared like this got caught. The bright yellow flame revealed the panic-stricken face of old Shen. He was confused and shocked because he didn't know why a senior audience member would attack him so decisively. The other party was really not afraid of punishment from the broadcast. What? Fortunately, Jizhen did not directly crush old Shen's soul, but sealed it, and then placed Qinbing's body next to Sudbai. Everyone present was smart. When they discovered that old Shen was an audience member who wanted to seize the body of an ancient corpse, they understood Sudbai's intention. Naturally, his purpose was to take the body of an ancient corpse. Sudbai had successfully forced Su Yuhang out of his memory, but was unable to get him out of his consciousness. In addition, the pressure on Sudbai from the broadcast began to increase. Before the fight started, Sudbai had the idea of destroying Su Yuhang's soul even if he fell down. However, Sudbai still underestimated the power of Su Yuhang's soul. If this situation continues, his soul will be destroyed. Before falling into the realm, the possibility of killing Su Yuhang was only 50%. Then, Sudbai, whose soul has fallen, will recover in the next today, but his soul will become a senior person and no longer the soul of a senior audience. Then, what awaits Sudbai will be unsolvable despair. Because of this, Sudbai was ready to take risks. He needed a physical body, a powerful physical body, a physical body that he knew could contain his remnant soul. Before midnight, he would take a gamble, forcibly split his soul, and use his remnant soul to enter the body of Qinbing, leaving Su Yuhang in his original body. What Subai was betting on was whether the broadcast at 0 o'clock would destroy the consciousness of Su Yuhang in his body, or the consciousness of his true self that occupies himself. This game could only be explained this way. If the broadcast follows the trend and regards Su Yuhang, who has Subai's body, as Subai, Su Yuhang will continue to perish in a one-day prison instead of his son, while Subai, in a theoretical sense, should no longer exist in a one-day prison. Japanese prisoners' story world, thereby completing a mission that does not exist in this story world in disguise. But Subai guessed that given the nature of broadcasting, it would not be so obvious. Even if broadcasting hated Su Yuhang in its heart, it would not let go of its own bitches. It was very likely that it would treat everyone equally. Attack both myself and Su Yuhang to see who can survive longer. And if this happens, then a powerful physical body is inevitably needed. Like Viagra, it is a long-lasting guarantee for a man. At least in Subai's view, even a boss-level audience does not specialize in physical strengthening. Yes, maybe its physical strength is not comparable to that of this ancient corpse of a Qin soldier. As for whether Su Yuhang will come out, that's impossible. Su Yuhang's split soul is like the piece of gold. He cannot see the light. He can only exist in the cognition under Subai's shadow. When Subai does not hesitate to when the gecko cut off his tail and cut off his soul to leave this body, Su Yuhang's fragmented soul, which had been forced out of his memory by Subai, could only continue to rest in Subai's separated soul, which was Subai's own body. But now, Subai thought of one thing in his mind. The fat man deliberately rescued old Shen from Tibet and asked him to seize the ancient corpses of Qin soldiers to seek revenge on him. And if we look at the time point of today, Fatty left yesterday, and old Shen will be asked to take revenge today. It's true. Just a coincidence. I wrote it 3 times and deleted it twice, so the second chapter came so late. How should I put it, this story and foreshadowing are actually somewhat idealistic. Long hopes to write it as clearly as possible so that everyone can understand it better. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 778. Subai remembered that Fatty messed up some things when he was flying back to Shanghai, and finally had to leave Laofang's family. But the next day, old Shen showed up to trouble Subai, but the old man Shen, who was fascinated by his confidence, was miserably taken down by Subai in the end. The ancient corpse of Qin soldiers was also placed at the door of his home by Subai as a gift from the fat man. At that point in the future, Subai had already discussed with Buddha. Buddha gave him an eel, no, it was a female corpse. Subai gave the Qin soldier's body to Buddha after he advanced and merged with the body. Use. But Subai was not without doubts. Fatty was a master who was unprofitable and could not afford to be early. Even if he wanted to give himself a gift, he would have to go all the way to Tibet to dig out old Shen and let him take the body of Qin Bing. Looking for revenge on yourself? This move really has the meaning of taking off your pants and farting. But what is not a coincidence is that on this specific day of imprisonment, in the previous reincarnations, old man Shen really kept appearing like a piece of dogskin plaster to increase his presence, because he wanted revenge, because hatred had already filled the gap inside of him. But now it seems that this is more like a reminder, because there are not many people Subai can contact on this day, because there is no point in asking ordinary people for his help, so if he goes through all the trouble, old Shen will be embarrassed. Ripe. Therefore, during the final fierce battle with Su Yuhang, Subai thought of old Shen. To be precise, he thought of the gift that the fat man gave him, the ancient corpse of the Qin soldiers. Subai didn't know whether Fatty calculated this intentionally or unintentionally. If so, how terrible was Fatty's causal calculation? But if Fatty had been able to figure out what was going on in the story world, Why was he so aggrieved when he was picked off by himself in Guangzhou? Perhaps these things can only be discussed in the future when the fat man appears in front of him again. Right now, Sudbai's most important things are how to kill Su Yuhang and how to leave this world of one-day prisoner stories. The confrontation between the two sides in the sea of consciousness quickly turned into a stalemate. On the one hand, it was because Su Yuhang was originally a separated soul and was forced out of his memory by Sudbai. Now it is regarded as a foreign body that has adhered to Sudbai's soul, but it is difficult to he was clean-shaven, and therefore, the tone had been set from the beginning. In the duel between the two sides, Sudbai had the right time, place, and people, and was already in an advantageous position. On the other hand, it is because Sudbai has slowed down his pace now and is not in a hurry to compete with Su Yuhang. Instead, he hangs Su Yuhang and restricts him to an area. If Su Yuhang succeeds and enters his memory again, if so, Sudbai will suffer a big loss. Of course, this possibility is relatively low, because the reason why Su Yuhang can live in Sudbai's memory is because when Su Yuhang started to cultivate, Sudbai was young and just an ordinary person, but he was bitten by a snake 10 times. Nian is afraid of straw ropes, so it's always good to be more cautious. Plus, for someone like Su Yuhang who can play tricks on the radio, God knows what other hidden skills he has. In this case, Su Yuhang stopped struggling. He knew that his only chance now was to wait until 0 o'clock to see who of the two sides could last 1 second longer. In the sea of consciousness, the images of two men appeared almost simultaneously. Su Yuhang was sitting on the ground, looking very free and easy. The scene suddenly changed, and the place turned into a courtyard. This is a scene in Sudbai's memory. In this courtyard, Su Yuhang once wrote and painted. In the blink of an eye, Su Yuhang also appeared in a white gown. He was already handsome and elegant, and now he was standing with a brush in his hand. When writing on rice paper in front of the stone table, a romantic and suave atmosphere comes out. Soon, Sudbai's figure also appeared here. It was still some time before 0 o'clock. Since both sides were waiting for the final decisive battle, they at least deliberately tried to live in peace for the time being. When Sudbai appeared in the yard, Su Yuhang said, "Do you want to write a few words? As a father, I haven't taught you anything, so I'll take this opportunity to teach you calligraphy." Su Yuhang said it very naturally, as if he and Sudbai were just separated father and son who could not see each other for some reasons for a long time, and there was still an ordinary father-son relationship between them. Sudbai walked over slowly and looked at the rice paper on the stone table. He had to say that Su Yuhang's handwriting was indeed very beautiful. But at this time, Sudbai would not be so bored that he would cooperate with Su Yuhang in acting. Showing the warm picture of a loving father and a filial son, he just whispered, "When I killed Grandpa, Grandpa was also writing." These words were undoubtedly a spoiler of freshness and ruined Su Yuhang's mood for writing. He put down his brush and sat down on the stone bench next to him without saying anything. A breeze blew and stirred Su Yuhang. "Of hair. You follow me, you are good looking, but your purple hair is really a bit disrespectful." Su Yuhang pointed at Sudbai's hair and said, "Who do you think you look like? Ximenchuixu or Li Tebe?" "Then who do you think I look like?" Su Yuhang asked. "Kong Yuji," Sudbai replied. "You kid, you're always so confused about style." Su Yuhang stretched slightly and said, "Do you still remember this place?" "Remember?" Sudbai nodded. He did remember this place. "I came here in my dream. Because my childhood memories are all fake. There are some things that you should actually understand." Su Yuhang sighed. "After all, I do regret it now. I have said this before." "Then you don't have to talk nonsense anymore." Sudbai also sat down on the stone stool next to him. "If you didn't want to hear my nonsense, you wouldn't have come here. Just let me entertain myself. As a son, no matter how bad the relationship between father and son is, you still have to do some ethical principles. Suyuhang looked at Subai in surprise and said with a smile, "I didn't expect you to think so. In the end, you have to give it away." Subai finished the last sentence. Suyuhang smiled and shook his head. The hatred between the two was actually one-sided, because Suyuhang actually had no hatred towards Subai. Yes, as a normal person, would you feel hatred for your own toy? Non-existent. But for Subai and Suyuhang, it goes without saying that the meaning of Subai's life now is that after losing the little one, killing his own parents is the top priority. Actually, when I was at the bottom of Kinhuangdao, I saw you going to avenge her. I was really surprised, because this is the audience circle, with the audience's own laws of the jungle. When you do that, you are doing it from the perspective of others or from the perspective of your friends. From a personal perspective, it is indeed a bit impulsive and brainless. But looking at it from my perspective, I really have an indescribable feeling. After all, you have my blood, Suyuhang's, flowing through you. At that time, I was really happy that I could still insist on avenging my parents. You are really thick-skinned. This can be followed, just like the gods in ancient Greek mythology. The father created the child, but in the end, the father and his children suppressed his mother, or the mother led her children to suppress the father, or the father himself. There are really many examples of swallowing up sons. Now that I think about it, these myths are not unreasonable. At least the people who compiled these myths should have put themselves into the perspective of God. Because only by looking at the world, family, and ethical relationships from God's perspective can we weave a story system like this. We, now equivalent to ordinary people, are not the gods in ancient Greek mythology. Subai believed that he had never had as many interactions with Suyuhang in his life as before. Also, who would be so bored as to chat and discuss the worldview of life with a guinea pig in his own laboratory? As far as Suyuhang is concerned, it is just because of Subai's growth and behavior that he has some artificial pretensions in his heart, just like those young scholars who express their sorrows for composing new poems and just treat them as a kind of food. Afterwards, we entertained ourselves by chatting over tea. I don't know what your purpose is, and I'm not interested in knowing. If you want to persuade me to change my view of you so as to whitewash you from me, then I'm sorry to tell you, don't waste it. Time to work. I never considered myself a god, I just wanted to do what I loved. Like killing your own parents, Suyuhang asked, pointing to his nose. It's just a similarity in DNA, Subai replied. Very good. Suyuhang pointed to the rice paper and brush on the stone table. The time is coming, don't you want to write something as a reminder? I don't think there is any need to be so pretentious, because I believe that none of us will hold back, and you are sure that even if the radio hates you, it will treat everyone equally. So I've always wished I couldn't understand your thinking. The current situation is obviously a father and son fighting for a chance to get out alive, but you are still here desperately playing the role of a loving father. It's boring to be idle, isn't it? Suyuhang stood up and motioned for Subai to get up too. Subai did not refuse this time. He stood up and walked to the stone table. He picked up the brush and dipped it in ink. He thought about it for a while and started to write. Soon, a couplet appeared on the paper. Do you like it? Subai put down his brush and asked. The writing on the paper said, unforgettable hands, eternal memories of family relationships. Inherit the legacy and praise the ancestors. A standard elegiac couplet hung in the morning hall after the death of a father. Suyuhang was not angry, but picked up the brush and wrote another picture next to it. White-haired children call from the north wind. The bones are buried in the loess and weep at the sunset. Immediately, Suyuhang put down the brush with great satisfaction and said, I'm looking forward to it. After midnight, which elegiac couplet should I use? Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao Long. Chapter 779. Click. The iron door was pushed open from the outside, and a chubby man stood at the door holding an umbrella. Zhang was back. In fact, if we follow the normal pattern, on this day, Fatty should be walking by the Huangpu River while talking to the remnant soul of the Qin dynasty princess in his body. He has not left Shanghai yet, and he has even come back to verify the matter of whether the little one was taken away from him. However, at this time, the original model line deviated. The monk sent a WeChat message to Fatty, concisely saying that this is the story world, we are all clones, and asked him to come back. A monk is not a person who can joke. If he wants to joke, he can only make some elegant jokes and not make fun of others. Fatty believes this. In addition, although he made fun of them yesterday, he found an excuse to leave. Here, the fat man really didn't believe that they would really trick him back and kill him. Therefore, there was nothing to hesitate, the fat man just came back. This is actually a bit embarrassing. After all, I left on purpose yesterday and came back today. I am not a brat, so how can I not feel ashamed? But there is really no other way now. If according to what the monk said, everyone is a clone, and this is a story world copied by the broadcast, then it will be shameless. Oh, my brothers are in a good mood. As soon as the fat man entered the door, he saw a table in the yard, with a big parasol on it to protect him from the rain. The table was fully stocked with tea, water, melons, and fruits. If it weren't for the fact that Subai and a body were lying next to the table, the ancient corpses of Qin soldiers, Fatty really thought they were calling him to come back for a tea party. The monk smiled and explained, I don't dare to open the magic circle to block the rain, for fear of affecting the things below. Immediately, the fat man put away his umbrella and took a seat. The monk told the fat man the whole incident. The fat man's reaction was exactly the same as that of monk Gyatso at the beginning. He stretched out his hand and pinched his face. Damn, this clone is so realistic, just like in a science fiction movie. Gyatso smiled knowingly beside him. He had the same reaction when he first learned the truth from Subai. Then who is Subai fighting against? Fatty asked, pointing to Subai who was still lying on the ground. I don't know. We analyze that it may be a foreign object residing in his soul. Otherwise, it can only be explained that Subai is fighting against the radio, but this is obviously impossible, Xie said. When the fat man heard this, he nodded and argued with the broadcaster that it was nonsense. But the fat man still squatted down next to Subai. He knew about the corpse of Qin being next to Subai and arranged for it to be delivered, but as for why he did this, the fat man didn't know. It's really unclear. He just got a clue when studying cause and effect. It's like seeing some broken pictures when a person is dreaming. The deep caves under Tibet and Laofang's house. These two pictures appear alternately, and the fat man he took it upon himself to act according to this clue. First, he relied on the remnant soul of the princess in his body to let old Shen successfully seize her body, and then arranged for old Shen to return to Shanghai to find Laofang's family for revenge. In fact, Fatty knew in his heart that even if old Shen, a spiritual enhancer, put a ninja turtle shell on him, he would only be passively beaten in front of Subai. Old Shen was a little lost in judging his own strength. Probably this Qin Bing body gave him too much mysterious confidence. There are two consciousnesses in the stalemate in his sea of consciousness, Fatty suddenly said. In fact, he was just repeating the words of the princess's remnant soul in his body, since Subai asked you to place the corpse of Qin Bing here, then he is planning to seize the body, or rather. The fat man crossed and uncrossed his hands while thinking, and continued. He wants to break away from that thing, either to insert another consciousness in his soul into this ancient Qin soldier corpse, or he wants to get rid of that consciousness and hide in. The three people at the table were silent when they heard this, but they obviously agreed with this view. In fact, the fat man's idea was similar to the discussion between the three of them before. Monk, you just said that this is a one-day prisoner story world, right? The protagonist is Subai, he is a real person, and we are all background boards, right? In this case, we will make a choice. Since this Jin Bing body it is used to prepare it for more, and it must be arranged for him. Whether Subai comes in or another consciousness comes in, the process must be made smoother. Amitabha, the poor monk called you back for this reason. This ancient corpse of a Qin soldier cannot be seen through or touched by the poor monks, let alone how to arrange it to facilitate the seizure, the monk said. Ji Zhen is an illusion enhancer but doesn't understand the formation. It's like asking a university history professor to conduct physics research. The fat man also knew that the reason why he asked this was just to pave the way for himself. He naturally knew how to use the ancient corpse of the Qin soldiers. Otherwise, how could old Shen get in? At that moment, the fat man began to pick up cinnabar and draw talismans on the ancient corpse of Qin Bing. At the same time, he also started to draw talismans on Subai's body. Looking at the fat man who was busy, the monk's eyes first flashed with doubts, and then he seemed to have figured something out, and then seemed a little indifferent. Gyatso found it quite interesting. He didn't know the formations, but he could tell that Fatty's runes were quite mysterious. Xie Zhen's consciousness has been shrouding Subai's side. He has no intention of observing Fatty's formation. After all, he is not a Taoist. He is more interested in Subai's current situation. Judging from the current inspection, the two consciousnesses seem to have ended the initial fight. The two sides are now very quiet, and it does not seem like a stalemate. It is more like they have agreed to avoid fighting together. By the time the fat man finished drawing the runes and rearranged a blessing circle here, it was already 11:45 in the evening. The fat man had to squeeze in the time to complete it. After all, the monk had said before that the prisoner was on this day ending and starting a new day at midnight. Since Subai and that consciousness kept calm in such a tacit understanding, he was obviously waiting for the final moment of the decisive battle. With this knowledge, and the people present were not stupid, they naturally thought clearly. After taking the tea handed over by the monk, the fat man took a sip and finally took a breath. After this, come back. The house is quite deserted without you, the monk said. I said, monk, it's useless for you to talk to me now. We are all clones, and I can't tell my original body. I changed my mind and was persuaded by your monk's lotus words to come back and live with everyone. After finishing speaking, the fat man laughed ha ha ha, thinking that he was fake now, which was really interesting. Then where do you plan to go next? The monk asked. Anyway, there are no secrets here. In a quarter of an hour, everyone will reset to zero. I don't know. Let's go to the Pearl River Delta. There are some things there that I need to check out. In addition, there seems to be news on the forum recently that they plan to organize a group of senior people to go to Guangzhou for some special activities. I will do it if I have time. Go check it out. At this time, the fat man didn't know that he was actually very close to the advanced audience there, but he was inexplicably picked off the peach by Subai. Haha, why do I feel like I'm going to die? Buddha joked from the side. Oh, we only have 10 minutes left in our lives. Too pessimistic, the monk retorted, the spirit lasts forever. Ha, this reminds me of a joke from the past. A leader held a meeting and took a manuscript written by his secretary to talk about Lei Feng's spirit. He said that Lei Feng's spirit is not dead and said that Lei Feng is not dead. The secretary next to him quickly reminded him that he is spirit. The leader immediately understood. Added, yes, he is still energetic, the fat man said. In the time spent talking and laughing, it was only 1 minute away from 0 o'clock. Time is almost counting the seconds. Fatty, Gyatso, the monk and Xie Zhen all stood nearby, looking at Subai and the ancient Qin soldier corpse lying on the ground. This was perhaps the last thing they could do that day. When it reaches 0 in 10 seconds. Subai's body suddenly trembled, and for a moment, the wind seemed to blow around him. Material reaction caused by spiritual collision, Xie said immediately. The next moment, a sound similar to the tearing of cloth came, and then, a broken white light flew out of Sudbai's body and disappeared directly into Qinbing's body. Immediately, Sudbai's body and Qinbing's body stood up instantly, facing each other, with only each other in their eyes. But at this moment, Sudbai's eyes were full of calmness and vicissitudes of life, as if he had experienced too much and had accumulated too much. The eyes of the ancient corpse of Qinbing were violent and bloodthirsty. Because for Su Yuhang, winning or losing is nothing more than the gain and loss of a split soul. The impact is there, but no matter how big it is not too big. At most, it is a hidden loss, being tricked by the broadcaster and his son. But for Sudbai, winning or losing means death. Ding. 0. Advent. In an instant, the monk, fat man, Gyatso, Xiezhen, Jixiang, and the little guy in the bedroom all disappeared. Everything around them disappeared and became blurry. Only the two people in the yard were still standing face to face. Su Yuhang, borrowing Sudbai's body, said, "You know, you couldn't survive for such a long time in the past because I was singled out. I couldn't stand it. Who called me a father? Right? He still wants to target me, but you can't stand it anymore." Indeed, Sudbai now only feels that countless hands are pulling him crazily, trying to force him into the order of the new day. If it weren't for Su Yuhang's involvement, maybe Sudbai would really do it. Just like before, I was instantly drawn into a new day. However, at this moment, Sudbai's remnant soul suddenly reflected a ray of golden light, and Qinbing's body also emitted a bronze light at this time. This scene made Su Yuhang's eyes suddenly tremble. Maybe even Sudbai himself didn't expect it? The gold had once completed the imperial seal. Although it had been integrated into Sudbai's body, there was still a trace of the imperial seal. This ancient corpse of a Qin soldier had swept across the country under the leadership of Xiulong more than 2,000 years ago. Bawang, the perception of the national jade seal is naturally still there. And both sides. At this moment, there was a strange response. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 780. People from Qin. Su Yuhang's eyes showed a hint of deep thought. Obviously, he also knew about Zilong and the chronology of more than 2,000 years ago. It was a mysterious era, and it may even have affected the origin of the existence of radio. Many secrets and mysteries on the earth today are actually deliberately traced back to the era of Alexander in the west and the era of the first emperor in the east. The great changes in the world 2,000 years ago caused the two great empires of the east and the west were annihilated, but too many things were passed down. It is normal for Su Yuhang to know these things. After all, Sudbai and the monk were able to deduce these things when they were seniors. It is impossible for Su Yuhang not to know at all. However, Su Yuhang seemed unwilling to spend too much thought on this kind of thing, because his attention was still on the broadcast at this time. A person, a residual soul, fighting against the rules of the broadcast story world, really it's a bit like a mantis using his arms as a car, but the car seems to be really stuck by him at this time. Back then, when Sudbai's clone appeared, he was forced to broadcast, but he didn't even touch the edge of the broadcast. But when Su Yuhang came here, a wisp of his soul was qualified to fight against the rules of the story world. At least, the rules did pause in front of him. This was already more powerful and terrifying than the black convenience store owner in the story world that Sudbai had just experienced and the demon on the mountain of the Taoist ancestral family. After all, although the two natives could see the broadcast existence, but when the broadcast obliterates them, they really have no way to do it, and even resistance becomes a luxury. They can only rely on their own abilities to do things that make the broadcast feel disgusting and destroy the story. A bit like how the Philippines and China competed for the South China Sea and clamored for war a few years ago. Gradually, Su Yuhang's body, that is, Subai's body began to fade away, and Su Yuhang's soul also began to become weaker. As for Subai, even though the ancient corpse of Qin Bing began to echo with the gold in his soul, the painful dragging feeling still existed, and Subai was even gritting his teeth and holding on. This is a rally and a protracted battle, but it is not meant to drag on for years. In fact, the time unit fought for is just 1 second. You know, every time you feel its power, you will feel that it is so beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful. You will subconsciously pursue it, understand it, recognize it, and then discover it. This is the greatest beauty in the world and the ultimate of all kinds of Tao. It's a pity that you don't understand this kind of elegance. What Su Yuhang is talking about is of course radio. In the eyes of ordinary listeners, it is the most terrifying radio. In Su Yuhang's eyes, it is the embodiment of beauty. Compare this to Liang Sen, who was curled up under his desk with tears streaming down his face when the breath of radio came. The difference is really obvious. The fierceness and redness in Subai's eyes began to slowly fade away, turning into confusion, and Qin Bing's body also began to fade. It is indeed unrealistic to use this body to fight against the operating rules of this story world. At this moment, Subai and Su Yuhang looked like they had just printed out A4 paper, with obviously insufficient ink. Time, every second is a kind of torture, and it is constantly amplifying. Your subjective consciousness begins to be hypnotized, and naturally, when you lose your persistence, you will sink into the next day again. Su Yuhang's eyes were calm from beginning to end. He didn't have the huge change from Subai's hysteria at the beginning to the confusion now, but it could be seen that he was a little tired now. I can't let him trap me here. Su Yuhang's words seemed not to be said to Subai, but more like talking to himself. According to its idea, it is more willing to keep this part of my soul. Here, let's follow the trend. In fact, the result is destined. Su Yuhang glanced at Subai, who had faded to only a shadow in front of him. Sorry, as a father, I can't give in to my son in this duel. Su Yuhang's aura suddenly rose. For a moment, his concentration, which had faded like Subai's, became much more solid at this time. It was like a person's reflection, but at this time, even if he could persist more, a few seconds is already a huge advantage. And this time, Subai's disadvantageous situation was suddenly revealed. The balance of victory and defeat seems to have completely tilted down, and there is not much suspense anymore. Gradually, Subai almost faded to the point where only the image in the sketch was left. But at this moment, the corners of Subai's mouth outlined a slight arc, as if the sketch artist had hastily sketched it out of interest. The effect produced is very vivid. At least, in Su Yuhang's view at this time, this arc was indeed a bit dazzling. It's a pity that now Subai can't make a sound and can't communicate, but Subai thinks it's enough. From Subai's point of view, the hatred for Su Yuhang is very clear and obvious. This kind of hatred does not need to be described with too many adjectives. If possible, Su Yuhang could endure so much torture that Subai would not. He would only give him 9 points of torture, which would be his own failure for Subai. So, when Su Yuhang felt that he had won, Subai felt happy. The real torture is to give you hope and then make you despair. Is not it? In an instant, Su Yuhang's body began to burn. This was the burning of his bloodline. This was the burning of his body. The various bloodlines in Subai's body began to rub and crack at this moment. In an instant, it became an incompatible trend. Su Yuhang seemed to understand something at this time. His expression was shocked at first, then angry, and finally turned into a touch of indifferent helplessness. I was also deceived by this son. He actually first attracted his attention with his unyielding momentum, and then pulled out the ancient corpses of Qin soldiers to engage in a tug of war with him. But in fact, both of these were deceptions. Even the most thoughtful and cautious person will subconsciously ignore the fact that Subai actually has a backup plan after seeing Subai's plan to prepare the ancient corpses of the Qin soldiers. In fact, Sudbai's first and second choices were just a cover-up to hide his true purpose. Two people, two souls, this is the posture of you within me and you within me. Sudbai knew clearly that even if the broadcast tried to kill Su Yuhang again, it would not make it so obvious. A bowl of water will be leveled. Therefore, he will definitely have a PK with Su Yuhang. The outcome of PK depends on who persists for how long. It is like an event A. Now the goal has changed from A to B and C. The B and C here are Sudbai and Su Yuhang. In order to enable the event to continue, then one of the two categories differentiated from A, B and C, must continue to be involved in the incident. Whoever persists for a long time can escape from this incident, but according to this idea, whoever allows a short time can also escape from this incident. Sudbai's body was like a powder keg, with all kinds of blood mixed in it. In addition, this body was not the body of a high-level audience and had not been tempered and integrated. Therefore, when Sudbai and Su Yuhang were in a stalemate in the sea of consciousness, when the monk was painting the formations on the ancient corpses of Qin soldiers, Sudbai had already secretly done some manipulations on his own body. These manipulations were actually just incidental, because the manipulations were only to allow him to control the explosion of bloodline conflicts in his body. Event, but it will definitely explode. In fact, it is bound to happen. Because Sudbai's many bloodlines coexist harmoniously through the adjustment of Sudbai's own soul. When Sudbai's soul goes out, it is like a bridge that has lost its support and collapses. It is really inevitable. In fact, Sudbai's arrangement was just to make Su Yuhang happy for a few more seconds. Boom. Su Yuhang, that is, Sudbai's body exploded, and Sudbai, who had merged into the ancient corpse of Qin Bing, felt that the power that had been pulling him suddenly disappeared, followed closely by what seemed like a heavy blow. He photographed himself directly. The world of punishment story ends. The sound of the radio came. The punishment story world itself has no rewards, so of course there is no need to say more. I just need to give you a notice. From the perspective of the broadcast, since the punishment story world is over, you have also accepted the punishment you should accept. Just like a person who has been released from prison, you can discriminate against him, but he still enjoys the same civil treatment as ordinary people. This time, the broadcast also gave a special reminder, which can be regarded as a reassurance for Sudbai. After all, it is similar to the one-day prisoner's story world. If the broadcast does not make a sound to remind the end, it is likely that the listeners participating in this story world will be so confused that you still feel that you have not come out. If you go crazy and kill some people out of nowhere, will you punish it or not by broadcasting? However, in fact, for Sudbai, this was like a dream, yes, because when he opened his eyes, he found that he was lying in the coffin. Inexplicably, after going through the struggle and torture in the story world of one day in prison, I suddenly felt a familiar and warm feeling when I saw the coffin again. It really feels like coming home, and it does. He reached out and knocked on the side of the coffin, making a muffled sound. Then he closed his eyes and started to sleep. Jixiang, who was lying lazily on the steps outside, heard the sound coming from the coffin. He first raised his head, and then knelt down again. He knew that Sudbai was back. In the distance, Ruyi was walking. When a sound came from the coffin, Ruyi also raised his head and looked at the coffin. He thought of the neighbor who had been lying in the coffin for 20 years. But it didn't know that after the neighbor left to be free, he soon discovered that he had already passed away. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 781. A dull and chaotic sound came from the altar, mixed with the rushing sound of the yellow spring water on the opposite side, making it even more messy. After playing for a long time, Sudbai finally chose to give up. The Guhan in front of him was a decoration here. It could also be said to be a funerary object. It had been buried underground for thousands of years and still had not decayed. It could even be said to be as new as ever. Although Mr. Su knows a lot of musical instruments, he has never learned the Guhan. He can play the piano well, but if you want to find a piano in this ancient tomb with a history of thousands of years, the difficulty is equivalent to that of the Han Dynasty. Go eat KFC. After trying for a while, Sudbai decided to give up. He originally wanted to sit on the altar and play the song Laughing in the Sea facing the underworld in front of him, but now it was obviously impossible to succeed. Then he pushed the Guhan away, and Sudbai stretched out his hand to take the jade seal of the Dian kingdom and played with it. Beside the altar, Ruyi and Jixiang were both crawling there, which made Sudbai a little embarrassed. Originally, young Master Su became interested after discovering the Guhan in the ancient tomb, and directly invited two cats to come and listen to his performance. As a result, these two cats were given an unprecedented honor today, and they all came, but his performance was messed up. Damn it, the only two audience members are still waiting here, while I, the only performer, is about to desert. Fortunately, Ruyi and Jixiang are cats, and they are both cold-tempered cats. They are too lazy to express any sarcasm towards Sudbai. Seeing that Sudbai has not tinkered with the Guhan, the two cats just do what they should do. The Dian jade seal is a little warm and feels good. For Sudbai now, his status allows him to play with the Dian jade seal at will, but it is impossible to keep it for himself. Although Sudbai is considered a semi-civilian, radio is not a state-owned enterprise after all. If you want to take advantage of broadcasting, you must first see if you have a good mouth. Putting the Dian Kingdom jade seal back to its original place, Sudbai looked at the yellow spring water in front of him. Sudbai suddenly thought of one thing. Su Yuhang's tombstone must be down there. It seems that his cheap mother's tombstone is also down there. When her son after so long, when I encounter my parents' tombstones, I have to burn something to commemorate them, no, to commemorate them. Even if they are not dead yet, I just hope that they will die soon. There are many funerary objects in the tombs, including silk and even pen and ink. Although the ancient Dian kingdom occupied a small area and its historical influence was basically negligible, even a mountain king occupied it for many years. You can also accumulate a lot of wealth, not to mention a country. Naturally, there are all kinds of funerary objects in this tomb. Things that the owner of the tomb could have used during his lifetime will be placed in the tomb, and there may even be more than one. Sudbai first wrote 2 elegiac couplets. This was an agreement between himself and Su Yuhang. He would send elegiac couplets to whoever came out. Now Sudbai treated them equally and gave one to his cheap mother. The elegiac couplet to Su Yuhang was the same as the one he wrote last time, with no changes. Sudbai added another one that read, "Keep in mind the kindness and pass it on to future generations, and leave a role model in the world forever." It was sour, so sore that it hurt my tooth, but Sudbai thought it was okay. He took the 2,000 couplets to the underworld in a good mood, and the water was temporarily closed. With Sudbai's current status, there was nothing weird about taking a bath in the underworld. Dare to come and confuse Sudbai like before, but Sudbai knows his identity here. Some things can be done, but there are also some things that cannot be done. Otherwise, according to Sudbai's previous temper, he would have gone down to the river with an iron hammer to kill Su Yuhang. The couple's tombstones were smashed. The 2 elegiac couplets were not burned, and Sudbai was thrown directly into the underworld. Many corpses in the underworld were even curious to grab and have a look. There was even a corpse whose half of the face had long since rotted and fallen off and could still recite. This place is actually no different from the underworld in folklore. There is an underworld, and there are countless dead souls in the underworld. As for Sudbai, he cannot be regarded as a bull-headed horse-faced man, because he cannot get out of here, but he is not regarded as the king of Yama, nor can he know dead soul will be brought before him for his judgment. Subai thought about the two cats, and a picture like this emerged in his mind. He was sitting on the altar, and Jixiang and Ruyi escorted the souls over one by one, waiting for him to slap the gavel to judge the guilty and innocent. This picture, quite interesting. In fact, Subai also noticed his own changes in his heart. It was probably because Su Yuhang's shadow was removed from his memory, and he also recovered the lost memories before. He became more cheerful, or at least became more cheerful. It was almost as natural as when I was not an audience member when I first went to college. Of course, one of the most important reasons is that if you want to live here without enjoying the hardships, it is really difficult. After being dazed for a while, Subai suddenly heard bursts of crying coming from the underworld. He looked over and found that it was the corpses and ghosts who were crying. Some of them were crying with true feelings, although they had no tears to shed. Some are howling dryly. Subai didn't know what was going on at first, but after watching it for a while, he finally came to his senses. These ghosts were trying to flatter him. When he saw that he had left 2 elegiac couplets, he thought he was mourning his parents. Then he started crying together. This made Subai dumbfounded. After leaving the underworld, Subai returned to his coffin. Instead of lying in it, he leaned on the coffin and smoked. There were several boxes of cigarettes left in the coffin where Su Fugui lay before, which was enough for Subai to smoke for a while. Of course, if Subai had been lying down for 20 years like Su Fugui, he would definitely not have enough cigarettes. He could only hope that he would be as lonely and boring as Su Fugui said, so that he would not even bother to smoke. It had been 3 days since he left the story world, and Subai's soul had not recovered from the injury. When he left the story world, as expected, the broadcast did not help Subai recover his soul, because Su Yuhang was the resident in Subai's soul. Can be regarded as one with Subai's soul. Subai's self-destruction of the soul's separation from Su Yuhang can also be regarded as a kind of practice, and it is also an act of self-subjective initiative. Broadcasting will naturally not help Subai recover, nor will it help Subai recover. Don't know how to recover. Could it be said that Su Yuhang's soul was repaired again? But fortunately, Subai's body pulled his soul to advance, and his body was unscathed. Therefore, even though the damage to his soul caused Subai's strength to fall below that of a high-level listener, and he could barely be regarded as half a high-level listener, he has regained his past. Subai's memory also received a kind of sublimation of the soul. As for the injury and recovery, it only takes a month or 2 to recover slowly. If we could get a healing method similar to what Su Fugui did to Ji Xiang last time, recovery would really be a matter of minutes, but it's obviously impossible here now. There was still no news about the little guy, and if there was news, Subai couldn't go out to look for it. However, the experience of 1 day in prison opened Subai's heart. He would definitely look for his son, but Subai would not be like before. She was as bitter and resentful as Mrs. Xianglin. After smoking 3 cigarettes in a row, Subai felt a little boring. When he felt boring, Subai's way to deal with it was simple, that is, sleep. Lying in a coffin, isolating the outside world, closing your eyes to rest, or actually sleeping, is a good way to kill time, because apart from this, you have no other way of entertainment. The 4 elements of life, food, clothing, housing, and transportation, only living can be solved here. The rest are basically out of the question. Even for food, Subai is basically following the immortal big grain method. Every day, the body absorbs some corpse energy to replenish it. Now, what do you want to eat? Unless you catch those 2 black cats and torture them to eat, you have to go to the underworld to find the corpses that are not rotten and skewer them into mutton skewers. Subai now thought that if he really had to live for a long time, he might actually be able to figure out how to play the instruments in the funerary objects. After all, he had the foundation of piano. If he thought better, he would be able to play the instruments in the funerary objects in the future. If the blood shadow clones can be solidified, then they can form a band by themselves. One will play the guhan by himself, another will play the fu, and another will ring the chimes. Then, facing the underworld, thousands of corpses will roar and cheer together and hold a solo concert same. Without thinking about it, Subai stretched out his hand and the coffin lid levitated, waiting for Subai to move in. But just when Subai stepped in with one foot, there was a sudden crisp above his head. Dong, dong, dong. Subai stopped and looked above his head. Could it be that someone had come to prove the truth? But those who come to attain enlightenment should come in through the front entrance, and there is no white light there. Obviously the entrance has not been opened yet, so it is impossible for someone to come to attain enlightenment. What's with the noise just above my head? Why is it like someone is knocking on the wall? It can't be that the entrance is right on top of a construction site where someone is laying a foundation, right? With this in mind, Subai just stood there and looked up. Soon, the sound of dong, dong, dong became clearer and more obvious. Until there was a crisp sound, a rock above actually fell down, but the rock did not fall down, but turned into dust and dissipated in the process of falling. A flat surface similar to a round mirror was exposed on it. It was as big as a square table. The color was darker and darker, similar to a bronze mirror. But Subai soon discovered that when he looked up, what appeared in the mirror was not him. Figure. On the contrary. What appeared in the mirror was a strange man in evening dress. There was also a coffin beside him, but the coffin was obviously more Western style. It depicted angels and devils from Western myths and legends, and the coffin beside Subai what is depicted above is the dragon giving birth to 9 sons. Subai raised his head and looked at each other in the mirror. Then the other party also looked at himself in the mirror. Immediately afterwards, the other party opened his mouth and shouted unexpectedly in English. I actually got through to you. Only then did Subai realize that the other party was holding a long sword in his hand. Obviously, the previous dong 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 sound was really the other party smashing the wall. And it seems to have been a success. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 782. Things did not develop as expected. In fact, more than a week has passed, and the progress of the communication between the two parties has still remained at the other side's sentence. I actually got through to you. Afterwards, the two of them just did whatever they were supposed to do. Subai lay back in the coffin to sleep. When he came out one day, he raised his head and looked at the bronze mirror. There was no one on the other side, and he didn't know whether he was lying down in the coffin or taking a walk. Of course, it is conceivable that there is not much area for the other party to wander around. Although they had never communicated with each other, Subai could roughly guess that opposite the bronze mirror should be the place of enlightenment in the West. Both companies, considered to be two subsidiaries of Broadcasting Corporation, have developed and advanced under the wise leadership of Broadcasting Corporation, and even presented a banner with brotherly units written on it. However, both parties were really not interested in greeting friends from the opposite unit. Subai felt that the person opposite was probably too busy, so he tinkered a little here and there, and finally succeeded. Well, to be precise, it is not connected, but it is equivalent to the effect of a video call. People cannot travel back and forth normally, but the sound and image can be synchronized. Being left in this place, unable to restrain himself from digging holes, is really not strange at all. Now isn't Subai also planning to tinker with those funerary instruments? Today, Subai first walked around the underworld. For the lonely ghosts in the underworld, this really felt like a leader's inspection. The previous leader had been in office for 20 years and was too lazy to get out of the coffin. But the current leader and the new official took office with 3 ultimatums, and everyone was careful to serve them. The two elegiac couplets thrown by Sudbai before, which caused thousands of dead souls and corpses to cry bitterly, are the best examples. In the real world, there are many examples where a leader's relative dies, and his subordinates kneel in front of the grave and cry more sadly than if their own father died. He raised his head and looked at the altar. The Guhan was still playing on it, and Sudbai didn't take it back. Anyway, there were no guests here except for the big guys who were Gendeo. Even the big guys who were Gendeo were not just cabbages on the roadside after all. One year it is estimated that there will be no more than 10 people who can come. This is calculated from the larger ones. The real number may have to be discounted in half. After all, Sufugui did not leave any duty list to tell Sudbai what year and month it was. So Anso came here to attain enlightenment. Looking at the Guhan and then thinking about his blood shadow clone, Sudbai couldn't help but turn his thoughts to the band again. Alas, there's nothing you can do about it. If there's no fun here, you have to take the initiative to create some fun yourself. At this time, the picture in Sudbai's mind was of several of his clones playing musical instruments, with his own body holding a baton and conducting in the underworld, and the thousands of corpses and souls in the underworld chorused neatly. The wind is roaring, the horses are braying, the yellow river is roaring, the yellow river is roaring, the mountains in the west of Hexi are tens of thousands of feet high, the sorghum is ripe in the east of Hebei, and in Hebei, there are so many anti-Japanese heroes in the mountains. After amusing himself in his mind for a while, Sudbai returned to the coffin from the underworld. At this time, the other party happened to be sitting next to the coffin like Sudbai, and both of them subconsciously looked up at almost the same time. Looking at the bronze mirror above his head, he naturally saw the other party. After a brief exchange of glances, there was still no communication. Although life here was very boring, neither of them was lonely enough to need to talk to each other. The opponent held a long sword in his hand and began to practice the sword, not paying attention to Sudbai's gaze. Sudbai just watched the opponent practicing his sword. After watching for a while, a playful smile appeared on Sudbai's face, because he found that the opponent's swordsmanship had a clear oriental shadow. Even ordinary people know what Eastern swordsmanship is like. After all, martial arts movies were the common memory of everyone in an era, and Western swordsmanship pays more attention to simplicity and efficiency. Although the essence of Eastern and Western swordsmanship is the same, the weapons in itself, it is nothing more than a bridge between defense and counterattack, but undoubtedly from an appreciation point of view, Eastern swordsmanship is better. Of course, this is also due to the fact that martial arts has gradually become an emerging cultural industry, and naturally there is a greater need to please the audience. The opponent's swordsmanship is flowing and flowing, with a special rhythm. His speed is not fast, and his steps are even a little slow, but he perfectly presents the rhythm of swordsmanship. The combination of man and sword cannot describe the feeling at this time. It's more like the human sword has a very obvious fit with the surrounding environment. Although the sword technique is slow and the movement is sluggish, if you dare to get close, you may be instantly shattered by the surrounding space. This is the power of an advanced audience, and the opponent has obviously integrated the sword technique with the surrounding environment. Even the current Sudbai can't do this. After being promoted to a senior audience, Sudbai can indeed enjoy the pleasure of torturing food, and has also defeated Xiezhen. But Xiezhen was promoted less than half a year earlier than Sudbai. He hadn't figured it out yet. In addition, his enhanced attributes were incompatible with Sudbai. His defeat by Sudbai could only be regarded as a special case. Simply speaking, compared with the surrounding with spatial compatibility, Sudbai can only improve his speed and strength and add some principles of spatial resonance. With this, it is natural that he will be invincible when torturing seniors. It is not a big problem to fight against senior listeners who are also newcomers. But if you try to fight for such an advanced listener who has perfectly integrated his own enhancement with the surrounding space, then you really can only wait for the answer to why the flowers are so popular. This is why advanced listeners are divided into newcomers, beginners, intermediate, and advanced listeners. Although they are collectively referred to as advanced listeners, the differences are really huge. Sudbai took a deep breath and stopped admiring the sword dance. He stood up straight, concentrated carefully, spread his hands, and a blood bead appeared on each palm. In fact, Sudbai knew in his heart that compared to finding some new things to relieve his fatigue in this tomb, the really interesting thing was to improve his own strength, and the pleasure brought by improving his own strength was unmatched by other things. Replacement. The blood beads on his palm began to float and lined up on both sides of Sudbai. Then, Sudbai opened his eyes and shouted in his heart. Buzz! Buzz! Two shaking sounds came. Next to Sudbai, two identical versions of himself appeared. This time, it was really impossible to tell any difference with the naked eye. As for the breath, they were all clones condensed with Sudbai's blood, so the breath was naturally the same. Sudbai still remembered the first time he experimented with this, in front of the vampire prince, and ended up with a clone that looked like a copy made by a printer without ink. But now, on the one hand, it is because I have understood and absorbed these vampire magics for a long time, and on the other hand, it is also because after becoming an advanced listener, I see the world differently. It is like a junior high school student. Even if you can get the correct answer when solving a problem for junior high school students and when a graduate student solves a problem for junior high school students, the ideas and effects of solving the problem are completely different. Hey hey! Sudbai smiled, and Sudbai, who was exactly the same on both sides, also made such a sound. Afterwards, the two clones sat cross-legged, while Sudbai himself was leaning on the coffin lid, somewhat idle. Now, what he wanted to do was actually to maintain this state while maintaining the existence of this clone, allowing the two clones to bear as much of their power as possible. This is not the power of blood inheritance. After all, the appearance of two clones is just a drop of blood essence. Unless Sudbai is willing to release more than half of his own blood to cultivate the clones, but that would be too stupid and completely loses the advantage of the clones. The attributes are almost equivalent to creating a clone of yourself. At this time, Sudbai raised his head again and looked at the bronze mirror above his head. The other person was still dancing the sword, but in the picture he was no longer dancing the sword alone, but two people were dancing the sword, and the other person was dancing with the other person. Got to be exactly the same. Excluding the low probability that Western Enlightenment places are non-mainstream and require a pair of CPS to act as caretakers, then it means that the other person is the clone of the other person. The original body and the clone were dancing sword together at first, but slowly, the two sides changed from sword dancing to practicing sword practice by feeding each other's moves. He and his clone were fighting back and forth, and Sudbai could see the ripples in the surrounding environment. Which proves that the sword practice between the opponent and his clone is definitely not a performance, but a genuine sparring exercise. Sudbai reached out and rubbed his chin. He couldn't tell whether the other party saw him practicing the clone and deliberately showed off, or whether it was really the other party's sword training process. Of course, Sudbai was not bored enough to bother with this issue. He was not so cautious. He just silently watched the opponent practice his sword. Slowly, Sudbai figured out some tastes on his own. He lit a cigarette. Continue to watch carefully. The other party continued to practice his sword seriously. About 2 hours later, the opponent sheathed his sword, and at the same time, the clone in front of him turned into smoke and disappeared. The other party raised his head, looked at Sudbai in the bronze mirror, with a contemptuous smile on his lips, and said in English, "Hey, Oriental, are you stealing lessons?" Sudbai nodded honestly. He was indeed stealing lessons. Of course, the other party deliberately showed him the clone sword practice when he knew that he was observing. In fact, it was like knowing that someone in his dormitory was short of money but deliberately giving away his own sword. It's like leaving all the money in a conspicuous place on the desk. So, how much have you learned? The other party asked. Absolutely, Sudbai was not modest either. In fact, he only needed a touch or a hint, and the other party gave him the best explanation, that is, the other party's clone draws strength from the surrounding environment. Instead of relying on the main body to conduct power transmission, even if the clone's power is very weak, if it can have the same ability to contact the surrounding environment as the main body, then the weak power will definitely have nothing to do with weakness after it has been greatly increased. Hearing Sudbai say that he had basically learned it, the other party was not surprised at all. They were all high-level listeners, and naturally they were smart people. If he couldn't be enlightened like this, how could such an idiot survive the initial experience? Ordinary listeners, low-level listeners, senior listeners all the way up to now. The other party continued to look at Sudbai with a smile, made a gesture of invitation, and said, "So, do you have anything of interest to me?"